The other big news of the day is the release of the JFK assassination files. For that conversation, I want to bring in to join both me and Kurt, Rob Bluey, who is the president and executive editor at the Daily Signal, and he joins us now as well. What's up, Rob?
Hey, Will, good to see you. Kurt, always a pleasure.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you guys. So it's 60,000 pages. 80,000 will be released in total. It's impossible to digest. So here's what we have done here on the Will Cain Show. We have gone to ChatGPT. We have gone to Grok. And I had a high recommendation from a friend just a week ago that I should start looking into the AI app Perplexity, which I did use last night. Now, these AI applications can analyze 80,000 pages, 60,000 pages in a record amount of time. And you can ask it to tell you what's new, what's revelatory, what's the biggest takeaway. And we did so. And I came away from the analysis of the JFK assassination files with about 3 or 4 interesting angles that have been supported. I cannot speak to how new this is because I haven't kept up with every document release and every minutia over the last 30 years. I simply have not. But what I found, guys, is that there is documented support, basically ammunition for every conspiracy theory. There is basically, you would come away from that and you'd be like, huh. And I don't know if I'm superimposing this after the fact. Oliver Stone was on to something, with JFK. There is documentation for example, Lee Harvey Oswald's relationship with the CIA. Without a doubt, there was a relationship with the CIA. Now, was that relationship simply somebody that was monitored and they failed to keep up with him and see the seriousness of what he was doing? Or was it overlooking it or putting him into play? But just as an example, I'm going to give you guys one example, and then I want to hear from each of you. There's documentation in there, and I think this was known, but that Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City reached out to both the Cuban and Soviet embassies. Those calls were transcribed and monitored by the CIA. They knew that he was trying to coordinate at least a quick exit to one of those countries. And this was in September and I believe October of 1963. There's more, but we'll start there. I think my reading is that you come away from this and you're going, it stinks. It stinks when it comes to the CIA, Rob.
Well, we're already starting from the point where a majority of Americans, in fact, there was a poll earlier this year from the Neapolitan News Service that found 54% of Americans think the federal government was involved in some way. So you have a majority of Americans who are already believing that there is some sort of conspiracy here with whether it's the CIA or some other branch of government. And so, yes, I do think I agree with you. There's certainly a number of things that, based on what I've read, you could point to and say, oh, my goodness, we've found something new here and there's a link and we're going to have to, follow this path and see where it leads. The big question, as you raise, is there are historians who have studied this for decades, and I think it's their expert opinion that we'll probably need to rely on because they have the full breadth and the whole context of what's going on here. As a teenager myself, I remember watching the JFK movie and being fascinated by this, and so I give President Trump the credit for releasing these and finally, after decades, putting them in the public sphere to review. And whether we do it through AI applications like you've done or just study them the old-fashioned way, hopefully we can get to the bottom of this and find some answers.
All right, Kurt, I think if we were looking for a top line, here's the top line. I want to hear your thoughts. It's at the end of all of this, the one thing that I think you can feel certain about is that Lee Harvey Oswald was not an unknown lone nut who killed JFK with no further context. There's just a bigger story. There's just more context. At a minimum, they missed Lee Harvey Oswald. At a minimum, they didn't see this coming and should have when it comes to Lee Harvey.
Well, look, the CIA is a failed organization. My limited interaction with it has left me distinctly unimpressed. I would think that a guy who had been a defector to the Soviet Union would be somebody that the CIA and maybe the FBI were watching, so they should have known about this. The key point you brought up to me, though, is it appears that, he was trying to build his own out, like Robert De Niro at the end of Heat. How am I going to get out of town after I pull off the big score? Which doesn't indicate to me that he was being that somebody was sponsoring him. It looked like a DIY kind of thing. So that bit of evidence actually supports the lone gunman theory. The fact is, I don't think the CIA could be part of a conspiracy because I think it's too damn incompetent. I think it's unable to perform even the most basic functions and has been for a long time. Hopefully that'll change under new management. But I think at the end of the day, until I see some more evidence, and the evidence you've given me today kind of supports my initial thought, this is an ex-Marine who knew how to shoot. He shot the guy twice. And not that far. I mean, I've walked around Dealey Plaza during times when I was in Dallas for court cases. And because we lack trust in our institutions, as a result of the institutions deserving our lack of trust, we've got a lot of conspiracy theories. But like I said, I don't really believe in conspiracy theories involving the government because after all my years working for it, I don't think it's capable of pulling it off.
Kurt, the only one thing
honestly,
that I did see...
it's... Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was just going to say the only thing that I did see is that we have to remember that even among all of the files that were released yesterday, there still could be some that the CIA is holding on to. And I think that that's the question we don't know.
That's true.
Do those files exist? Have they been destroyed? Is there evidence that the National Archive simply doesn't have in its possession that might lead to more answers? And so I think Will is onto something with this Mexico City connection, and it at least, leads us down a little bit of that path. But I don't know that even despite 60,000 pages, we're going to have the answers that we need.
Well, maybe we'll find the stuff about Ted Cruz's dad in there. I don't know. Could be.
You're absolutely right, Rob. It's impossible to trust that you would actually get the full picture. If it wasn't destroyed or not released now, it was destroyed in the 1960s or 1970s. And I don't know why it would have been left in some file to be revealed later. And if there was a plot, I don't know why it would ever have been documented in the first place. And I also think the simple but most often true point, and I was pointed out yesterday, I called it Murphy's Law on TV, it's Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the right explanation because complexity and conspiracy require a level of competency that is hard to see inside of any organization, much less the CIA. What it is, though, is the nexus of overlaps that definitely are documented. So Oliver Stone paints a picture in a movie that is widely discredited and seen as unserious. And he paints a picture of overlapping connections between the CIA and the Mafia, then the CIA and anti-Castro groups, and Oswald's relationship to anti and pro-Castro groups in New Orleans. And finally, Oswald's relationship to the Soviets, both his original defection and then return, and then his ongoing relationship with them in Mexico City. Those overlaps, painted as a ridiculous conspiracy in the movie JFK, are documented in these files. That much is true. Like, we know from these files that the Mafia was used by the CIA in failed assassination attempts of Fidel Castro. The Mafia had a relationship with the CIA where they were the foot soldiers trying to get rid of Fidel Castro. Those Mafia bosses have connections to some guys in New Orleans mob bosses. And potentially then, and it gets more tenuous, and I totally acknowledge it, to Jack Ruby, Oswald's assassin. Same thing with the Castro stuff. Like, at one point, Oswald is marching or trying to join anti-Castro groups. Then he's a pro-Castro guy, and he is interacting and getting in a scuffle with anti-Castro guys. All those anti-Castro groups, by the way, funded by the CIA. They were absolutely funded and created to run the streets of New Orleans and other places in America by the CIA. So what you get documented is this overlapping picture of relationships. Do those relationships lead us to any smoking gun that, oh my gosh, Lee Harvey was actually a CIA asset, and he was actually, as he said, a patsy to be the man who executes this on behalf of the CIA, attempting to eventually place this on Castro? No, there's no smoking gun. But the documents do show all these weird relationships that give ammunition to someone that goes, maybe Oliver Stone is not a complete crackpot, Kurt.
Well, look, there's lots of things out there. I mean, Jack Ruby, of course, was mobbed up. He was a strip club owner. And the Kennedys had an adversarial sometimes relationship with the mob. Other times, they shared girlfriends. Um, and look, there's a lot of pieces at play, but at the end of the day, we've got a communist who had been a defector who knew how to shoot. And he was obviously there. I mean, he killed J.D. Tippit, the police officer, afterward. I'm kind of an Occam's razor guy. I think it was just this commie jerk. Although I love how it's become like this trope that the right wingers killed him. The right winger who defected to Russia. That's always been interesting to me. But look, I think the simplest explanation is usually the most likely. Again, I've got trouble believing the CIA or any of these other organizations could manage to pull this off and keep it secret for, gosh, a year longer than I've been alive.
Yes, real quick to you, Rob. And obviously, like any American, I'm interested in this conversation. And I want to have this conversation in a way. It seems like you get two groups of people on this. Those that are completely dismissive of the conspiracies, which has been the majoritarian line, I think actually for most of the last half century, even though 65% of Americans, as you point out, Rob, believe there was more than Lee Harvey Oswald and the government might have been involved. But that's sort of the majoritarian line. But if I cross to the other side, then it's like down the rabbit hole I go in Alice in Wonderland, where I am looking at every single connection, kind of like I'm hinting at right now. But I am roughly familiar with the rabbit hole. And to Kurt's argument, the rabbit hole argument is that he was an asset, Lee Harvey, of the CIA, and it was a fake defection to the Soviet Union. And he was a fake pro-Castro guy. And he was actually used to eventually try to plant this entire assassination on Castro. The argument is to justify revisiting the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, now successfully going in and getting rid of Castro. Rob.
Yeah, and let's put ourselves in the context of the time. I mean, which you just did. I mean, we have to remember what was going on in the world and how that there were some in the Washington establishment at the time who were frustrated with Kennedy and some of his decision making. And so all of that, is part of the whole map. And Will, you just went through all of those various things that we've learned. You connect all those dots, and yes, you probably can have somebody who goes down that particular rabbit hole. One thing that also came out was the fact that it just shows the CIA's involvement in so many of these institutions. I believe it was in Paris. The CIA had such a strong presence within the State Department there, and so it just raises questions. I think in the minds of Americans are to this day, does the CIA, are they operating in these different agencies? And it fast forward to the summer of 2024 and Butler, Pennsylvania, and any of the unanswered questions we have about the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. Who millimeters away from losing his life, and I'm frustrated that we still don't have the answers to what happened in that situation.
Yeah. To your point, by the way, the documents do show how active the CIA was in coups across the world, including potential assassinations, I believe, in Vietnam, I believe it was Laos or Cambodia, and in Cuba. It's not like this is like, obviously doing it at home is one other huge thing. And there's no doubt that there was an antagonistic relationship between the intelligence community and JFK. No doubt about that. I don't know. I'll give you the last word on this, Kurt. I do think Rob makes an interesting point about Trump's 2 assassination attempts. Like, are we going to have to wait another half a century to get the details on what actually went down in Butler, Pennsylvania?
Well, that assumes anybody's bothered to investigate it. We know almost nothing about the guy who somehow got 150 meters from the president with a rifle. Yet another institutional failure. The best case is a massive institutional failure. The best case is, what a relief. They're merely grossly incompetent at the one job they have. I frankly, I don't think the FBI knows. I don't think they've actually done the work to get this investigated and to get this understood. I just don't think they've done it. I don't think they cared. Maybe under Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, they will.
To your point, Kurt, if you're right, if you're right that the minimum revelation is all we can take from this, that these institutions, be it the Secret Service, the CIA, or the FBI, were incredibly incompetent in Butler and in Dallas, then also I would add, whatever the Israeli intelligence apparatus was that missed October 12th, and that's the argument, just missed it, is yet another example. Like, how do you miss thousands of dudes massing to invade Israel? And that's why people start going, you can't be that incompetent. This is your mission. This is where conspiracies come from. If that is our takeaway, if that's all we have, that you are massively incompetent, these organizations need to start publicizing their successes. Like, it always is shrouded in conspiracy, right? Until they fail.
Start having
what are you good at? Which ones have you stopped? Or telling us, the presumption is, oh, you don't tell us when you have big successes. We don't have any idea how many terror plots that you've stopped. Well, maybe you should start telling us, because otherwise, I don't see what you're doing well.
Well, look, what are they doing well? What have they done well? We failed in Iraq. We failed in Afghanistan. Libya is a disaster. Syria, I don't even want to go into. That just makes any normal human being sick. Look, all our institutions are failing. And the end result is this lack of belief in the institutions and an understanding that many of them can't be reformed. They've got to be raised. So hopefully the CIA can be reformed into something that performs its job. But we'll see, because there are a lot of people who aren't in these institutions to do what the institutional purpose is. They're in these institutions either to get a pension or to promote their, communist ideology.
And transparency is a great form
Kurt
of
Schlichter.
accountability.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kurt Schlichter is the author of Attack. Check him out at townhall.com. Always good to get him in on all these subjects, most especially what is going on with the showdown between the judicial branch and Donald Trump. Kurt, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, great talking to you guys. Thanks a lot.